tax and how to deal with pipeline politics, which is another a favorite discussion up in Canada, as well as, bruised by trade actions from China, bruised by the 232 tariffs coming from the United States, and yet the result was a strong minority for the Liberals and a resurgent bloc. And so I think what I'm going to do is just ask you the question that everyone's thinking is, what exactly happened?
Yeah, to use a good Canadian analogy, it was like having a breakaway on an open net and missing the net. And before I begin and answer your question, Sarah, thank you for the question. I want to pay tribute to my colleagues from the Political and Diplomatic Corps who are here and from State Department, Canada Embassy. I feel really blessed to have worked with many in this room, but to have seen from a very unique vantage point the incredible dedication, professionalism within the public service of both of our countries, which to me, like our institutions, is the foundation upon which this relationship is always going to be strong, regardless of who is occupying the White House or 24 Sussex. So that to me was a real gift. And I'll also mention that I am cheering for the Washington Nationals to win the World Series.
I think Alex is too, but he calls them by another name.
but I know that's tough from a Cubs fan, and but I also have to qualify. They used to be the Montreal Expos. To answer your question, you sort of gave a litany of some of the issues that were dogging Prime Minister Trudeau heading into the election. You left out his trip to India and the SNC-Lavalin affair, which is a much more serious issue that is still a live issue, in my opinion. And we can come back to that. Alex may comment, but I think that issue is going to be present in the upcoming Parliament and may impact on some of the information that Nick Nanos put forward, only insofar as the ability for the Parliament to work. What went wrong? Well, I'm going to be very honest with you. I think there was a number of issues that became very prevalent in this election that nobody other than the politicos wanted to talk about. People did not want to talk about women's reproductive rights. They didn't want to talk about revisiting the issue of same-sex marriage. And yet that was thrust onto the agenda and hung around Andrew Scheer's neck like a stinking albatross, quite frankly. And he wasn't able to deftly deal with those issues when the opportunities arose. And I think among female voters in particular, and those who would have been impacted by any revisitation, it created a nervousness, or it took them out of their comfort zone if they were considering voting Conservative, which, frankly, having known Andrew Scheer, which Nick alluded to, like Stephen Harper, who was Prime Minister for almost 10 years, there was no intention, and is no intention, to revisit those issues. But it created an aura, inaccurate, but impacted very much at that point when people entered the ballot box. I also think there's another major issue, and I do agree somewhat that it was a Seinfeldian election. There was opportunities to seize the agenda with a big issue. The closest, in my view, that we came to seeing a big issue was either climate or energy. And on energy, Andrew Scheer actually presented what I think was a compelling idea, but didn't fill in the blanks of having, he called it an energy corridor, I call it a financial corridor, that would span the country for communications purposes, for the purposes, yes, of transporting bitumen from the oil sands in Fort McMurray, but in Saskatchewan as well, to bring Canadian energy to Tidewater. But the issue really didn't catch on, and it didn't really become a factor. Same with green technology. And while Andrew Scheer was pounded over the fact that he was late in producing a green plan for Canada, when he did, his idea, again, I felt had merit. It's going to be technology, not taxes, that will help us tackle climate change, which I personally believe in. But how do we get there? And the answer is the previous reference, by transitioning from energy, of which Canada is a superpower. And even the United Nations has said it's going to probably be about 40 years before we transition away from fossil fuels. So You know, and one of our former prime ministers famously said that elections are not a good idea, not a time to have these important discussions. Well, they are. But it's difficult, you know, with the pace of information and certainly now with social media to get traction on some of these big issues. But that's part of the analysis of, I think, what went wrong in terms of Andrew Scheer's campaign. And I think at the end of the day, it was a bit of a Hobbesian's choice. I think Canadians were not enthusiastic, let's say, or inspired by either vision of either party. And then there was, you know, there was a little bit of last minute jockeying that jarred people away from the Conservative Party.
There's a lot of excellent points that Peter Mackay is raising in this interview. So I make this video in response to Rona Ambrose and Pierre Poilievre dropping out of the race, which means that Peter Mackay and the other candidate, I can't remember his name off the top of my head now, which is just disconcerting, but it doesn't matter. Mackay, to me, is the obvious choice because he is a household name, essentially. He's been in politics a long time. A long time. He's held the profile of Minister of Defense, Minister of Justice. I think Peter Mackay was a little bit heartbroken 4 years ago when he made a statement politically that he would not run for re-election. And after that point, and 4 years ago, so you know that's right after Stephen Harper was defeated. So he sort of recused himself from politics for a while, and he essentially stepped out of the limelight, if you will. But I think when he started to realize that Trudeau was becoming Canada's problem, that was the turning point for him to say, look, I better get back involved in the fight. And what he did was to mitigate this. He went in front of the media, in front of the press, and essentially tried his best to expose the SNC scandal, try to defend the honor of Mark Norman and say he was innocent because as Minister of Defense he would have been sort of in proximity with those cases. So his defense of Mark Norman was absolutely necessary, and I'm happy that he did it. In addition, he has a very good fiscal policy that I understand, starting with a balanced budget, naturally. But I don't think that Mackay will spend and waste money as Trudeau does. I think if you were to compare the two of them, Mackay is by far a more reasonable option and far more logical. The Liberals' spending is out of control. I know that's said a lot in political campaigns, but I mean, if you really study the budget, they're talking about the potential to put us near $1 trillion in debt, I would say, and stealing money from pensioners, from veterans, from people that have just had children, the child care benefits, and increasing the power of the CRA to such a point that it's Trudeau is exploiting Canadians. That's how I would put it. Using the legal taxation system, but using it ruthlessly in a way. And Peter Mackay is not that individual. The fact that he brings up the LGBTQ movement, same-sex marriage, and women's reproductive rights, that's very, very good for a party that's essentially alienated those people in the past. And when he talks about the Hobbesian vote, essentially, I felt the same exactly what he said. He nailed it home. A lot of people were on the fence and they didn't think that Scheer was any better than Trudeau. That was the problem. Scheer is the foremost to blame for the election loss, but essentially they thought that the Conservatives would be like a radical change in that respect to those groups once the Conservatives took power. And I'm happy that Peter Mackay essentially he addressed that and said, no, we're not going to do. That's pretty much going to be status quo, blah, blah, blah. And I do believe that it made those groups very uncomfortable and swayed their vote in the end, because a lot of them, the uncertainty alone when it comes to their personality would make them doubt voting in that way. So, and in addition, Scheer did nothing to mitigate the party's reputation in the past to try, or even his own, in fact. Scheer did nothing to dispense the vagaries surrounding his personality in that manner. And he did nothing. It remained a vague part, like a shadowy part of his character that was open to interpretation. And the media spun it in such a way that it would be the most politically damaging for him. I had friends that said he was a transphobe, people that said he was against gay marriage, and so on and so forth. And in practice, I believe Scheer isn't those things, but he was scapegoated as such. And that was the problem. Scheer did nothing to amend that problem. And Mackay here is talking about missing with an open net. He's right. There is no amount of competence that Scheer could explain himself away after the amount of scandals that the Liberal Party had done, that they could be re-elected if there was even one legitimate option open. And it's really pathetic. And I can see that Mackay is deeply angered by the performance of Scheer and the fact that we're stuck with Trudeau for another 4 years due to his incompetence. So this was more like a video of condemning Scheer, but really the point that I was trying to make is that Mackay might point us in the right direction. I think Mackay is extremely mature now. He's gone through a lot. He's definitely passed through many different generations of politics, and he's been around a lot of things concerning the Conservative Party, but what makes me trust him is that he did come back after he had left politics and had given up hope, essentially. You never think about it from the personality of an individual, how it takes a toll on you to be defeated in such a way after sacrificing so much for the country, and then be defeated by a clown like Trudeau. I understand Harper's resignation, and I understand Peter Mackay's resignation as well, because I would want to walk away also in a situation like that. It is disheartening, and also it's unfair because of the hard work that these individuals did for our country. And I don't care what anybody says, Harper carried Canada during the recession. His government, his fiscal responsibility helped us mitigate the effects of Obama. And I don't care what anybody says. That's what happened. That's the truth. Their fiscal responsibility put Canada in a very... It's the exact reverse of what we have now. Canada was strong, the US was weak. And now the US is strong, Canada is weak. Because the shoe is on the other foot, essentially. What Mackay will do, I believe, as opposition leader, he'll be very strong. He'll be like a major attack dog. And what I like about him is that he's not going to apologize. He'll attack. The SNC scandal is all but wiped away. The media is quiet about it. You haven't heard a thing about it. I think the Conservatives need to rethink their strategy. People kept saying, that they're repeating till they're blue in the face and all that. But that was just, again, the media trying to swipe things under the rug. I do apologize for the movement of the camera. I'm using my tablet. So, essentially, what the Conservatives have to do is they need to update the party for the times. The old conservative values can remain, but it has to transform, if you will. It has to be including more. They're alienating too many voters. They're not doing enough to bring enough people into the fold, to encourage people to vote, as Mackay said there. And these people who are feeling alienated, they're strong. They shouldn't be ignored. They need to have a proper voice in the Conservative Party, and they need to be represented because they're citizens. And essentially, those voters flock to the NDP, to the Liberal Party, and they're lost. And, Mackay, I think Mackay will answer that question. Can we bring them back? Can we encourage them to vote for us? Can we swing the voters to us? Scheer is not the man to do that. Peter Mackay is the man to do that now. I still can't recall the name of the other candidate that's running. What I do know is if you examine his Twitter feed, there's a lot of anti-Jewish things going on there. I don't know if that's 100% to do with him or with other people on his Twitter feed. But essentially, I just looked into it, and they're already trying to attack what Trump is doing with Israel and so on. So I don't want to get into that too much, but all I'm saying is that Mackay is a clear choice. Mackay will try to change the image of the party while retaining the strong values of the past, I think, because Mackay has seen it. A person in that position is extraordinarily positioned to be both the past and the future. So update the party's image, update the party's reputation, bring more people into the fold, into conservatism. Because it's nothing to do with a lot of these personal partisan nonsense. It's to do with the right thing. The country is in turmoil. That's a truth. We are suffering in Canada, and it has to be remedied. That's not a partisan statement. That's a blatant fact. Under Trudeau, what prosperity has Canada seen? Nothing. We haven't seen it. Maybe in the viewpoints of a few people we've seen it. But I call that delusion. Because, if our economy is that poor, and if people have less money in their pockets, and I would argue that the taxation has become so brutal that people are already strapped and poor, and they're still trying to squeeze every dollar they can grab and waste it. That's not a partisan statement. That's an observation from people whom I speak to. The livelihood of people has been endangered. So it's a deeply Canadian problem, and I think that Mackay will have his work cut out for him, because Trudeau, there are a lot of things about him that's very deceptive. Not to mention that the media is in his pocket, so they do a lot to protect him for his reputation, despite blackface, despite SNC, despite Mark Norman, despite giving money to convicted murderers, terrorists, and his love of communist China. Those things aside, which are deeply concerning, deeply worrying, his love for ideologues, for radicalism, and so on, it's really We need someone in this country who is going to be a firm, responsible leader. Somebody strong, somebody who's not going to bend like that boy prime minister. And I think we have him here. He is a clear choice. So I thank you for your time and your attention. I hope that Peter Mackay will run a strong and focused campaign. I hope that his heart is completely devoted to it and that he will run as a strong opposition leader if elected. So I hope there are a lot of candidates that would have been great. Maxime Bernier, you who follow my channel, you'll know that I really, really enjoy, and I would have loved to see that man be leader. But he walked away from a winning situation just as the tide was turning. And he shouldn't have. He should have been more patient and stayed with the Conservative Party and tried his best to further his views with time. But essentially now we have Peter Mackay. This country cannot fragment further. It has to stop. The national identity is already in question. There's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that people don't know about, that undermine our true society that made this country great. And we need a prime minister to restore balance. So that's as simple as it is. Trudeau is not that man. Trudeau has already proved himself to be a person that divides people, that divided Canada, that created animosity and hatred, that destroyed our borders, that let in criminals, and has no care for his own citizens. I can't name an individual who is more disenchanted, more disconnected with Canada, with Canadian citizens in particular. That Trudeau is the person who is completely disconnected from Canada and from reality, I would say. And Mackay simply has to point that out and concisely point it out to Canada so that we can see Trudeau's real face. Because he's shrouded in so much like the media protecting him from the true damage that his reputation should suffer. The family name of Trudeau had no place in politics. They are a family of irresponsibility, of playboy characters, charm, but really underneath is a facade for something much worse. I look at this family, I tell you, that cannot continue. We need discipline and we need order and we need balance in this country. And I hope that Peter Mackay is the person to do it. Thank you for your time and attention. Bye-bye.